In the spring of 2019, a small surveying team wading through the suffocating heat of Louisiana's Atchafalaya Basin stumbled across something their instruments simply could not explain. Their ground-penetrating radar was returning readings that suggested massive geometric forms buried beneath 12 feet of swamp sediment, forms arranged with a mathematical precision that no natural process could account for. These were not random geological anomalies, not shifting clay deposits, not tree roots warping the soil into unusual patterns. These were structures, and according to the dating methods applied to the sediment layers surrounding them, they had been sitting in that darkness for somewhere between 50,000 and 130,000 years. Information from internet sources, links in description. Subscribe, let's begin. To understand why this discovery shook the people who made it to their absolute core, you need to picture the Atchafalaya Basin on a normal working day. Imagine standing in water up to your thighs, the air so thick with humidity that breathing feels like drinking, the cypress trees draped in Spanish moss rising around you like the columns of a cathedral no architect ever designed. The team was there for routine infrastructure work, mapping subsurface conditions ahead of a pipeline survey, doing the kind of unglamorous technical labor that rarely makes headlines and almost never changes history. They were not looking for ruins. They were not archaeologists. They were engineers with radar equipment, and the radar equipment started telling them something that made no sense at all. The first anomaly appeared roughly 3 miles east of the town of Henderson, Louisiana, in a section of basin that sits under between 4 and 15 feet of standing water, depending on the season. The ground-penetrating radar unit, which sends electromagnetic pulses into the Earth and measures how they bounce back off different densities, began registering what the lead surveyor later described as walls. Not wall-like shapes, not vaguely rectangular shadows in the data, but actual right-angle corners, actual flat surfaces meeting other flat surfaces at deliberate angles, buried under more than a decade's worth of accumulated swamp sediment, and below that, compressed layers of peat and clay going back thousands upon thousands of years. Think about it. The sediment alone told a story. To reach these anomalies, you would have to dig through material that accumulated across timescales we barely have the imagination to process. The team flagged the data, noted the coordinates, finished their assigned work, and then did something that speaks well of their professional curiosity. They came back. On their own time, with borrowed equipment and a geologist colleague from Louisiana State University, they returned to the site twice more over the following 4 months. Each return visit produced more anomalies, each one more geometrically impossible than the last. By the end of that summer, they had mapped what appeared to be a complex of at least 7 distinct subsurface features spread across approximately 2.5 square miles of the basin floor. You are looking at an area roughly the size of 800 American football fields, all of it containing evidence of deliberate construction sitting in the dark beneath your feet. The geologist from LSU, who has since been identified in various reports only by her first name, Sandra, brought in optically stimulated luminescence dating equipment on the 3rd visit. This is a technique that measures the last time sediment grains were exposed to sunlight, essentially asking the dirt when it was last on the surface of the Earth. The results from samples taken at the depth of the uppermost anomalies came back at a minimum of 50,000 years before present. The deepest samples, taken from material packed tightly against what the radar suggested were the sides of the largest structure, returned dates clustering around 130,000 years. Imagine holding a handful of that mud and knowing that the last human hands that touched the thing it was pressed against lived before our entire species had fully separated itself from its evolutionary ancestors. Here is where the story becomes genuinely uncomfortable for mainstream science, and you need to sit with that discomfort for a moment. The earliest accepted evidence for complex human construction anywhere on the planet is roughly 11,000 years old, represented by sites like Göbekli Tepe in modern Turkey, a site so ancient it was already shocking when it was discovered. The pyramids of Giza, which most people think of as impossibly old, were built around 4,500 years ago, meaning Göbekli Tepe is more than twice as old as the pyramids. Now take that already staggering figure of 11,000 years and multiply it by more than 10. That is the gap between what we thought we knew and what the Louisiana sediment dates were suggesting. You are not talking about revising a chapter of the history books. You are talking about throwing the entire library out the window. The question that immediately arises, and the one that the surveying team spent months struggling with before going public with any of their findings, is this: could the geometric forms have a natural explanation? The Earth is full of surprising geometries. Basalt columns form perfect hexagons when lava cools slowly under the right conditions. Limestone dissolves into cave systems with cathedral-like chambers that seem almost designed. Certain types of soil compaction under pressure create patterns that superficially resemble walls when viewed through radar. Think about all the times in science where the extraordinary turned out to have the mundane explanation. The team knew this. Sandra knew this. They spent months trying to prove to themselves that what they were seeing was natural, and according to what they have shared with researchers since, they failed completely to do so. The feature that most resisted natural explanation was what the team came to call the primary formation, the largest of the 7 anomalies, located in the deepest and most water-saturated section of the survey area. The ground-penetrating radar profile of this structure showed a rectangular footprint measuring approximately 60 meters by 110 meters, which for reference is almost exactly the size of a standard city block in New Orleans, roughly 6 blocks away from the famous French Quarter. The walls of this structure, if that is what they are, showed consistent thickness across their entire measurable length of approximately 2 meters, and the corners resolved at angles so close to 90 degrees that the deviation measured by the software fell within the instrument's own margin of error. Nature, even in its most geometrically creative moods, does not build city block-sized rectangles with 2-meter-thick walls and perfect right-angle corners and then bury them under 100,000 years of swamp. By the winter of 2019, word of the survey data had quietly reached a small number of researchers outside Louisiana, passed along through the informal networks that exist in every scientific field, the late-night emails and conference hallway conversations that often carry more real information than published papers. One of the people who received that data was a geophysicist based in Texas who had spent 15 years studying anomalous subsurface formations in the Gulf Coast region. He asked not to be named in early coverage of the site, but his assessment of the radar data was unambiguous and unqualified. He told the team, in his own words, that he had never seen a naturally occurring formation that matched what their equipment had recorded, and that the depth and integrity of the surrounding sediment layers made any kind of recent human interference with the site essentially impossible. You have to let that sink in for a second. A 15-year veteran of Gulf Coast geophysics looking at this data and having no natural explanation to offer. The Louisiana Department of Culture, Recreation, and Tourism was notified of the anomalies in early 2020, and here the story takes a turn that will feel familiar to anyone who has followed the history of unconventional archaeological discoveries. The department acknowledged receipt of the survey data, assigned it a case number, referred it to the State Historic Preservation Office, and then entered a period of institutional silence that has stretched, with minimal interruption, to the present day. No official investigation was launched. No state archaeologist was dispatched to the site. No funding was allocated for follow-up survey work. The case number sits in a filing system somewhere in Baton Rouge, and the swamp sits in the Atchafalaya Basin, and the structures, if that is what they are, continue to sit beneath both of them, exactly as they have been sitting for somewhere between 50 and 130,000 years. What makes the official non-response particularly striking is the timing. The survey data arrived at state offices in January 2020, just weeks before the COVID-19 pandemic reshaped every institution's priorities and budgets simultaneously. You could argue, charitably, that the timing was simply catastrophic, that a finding requiring serious multidisciplinary investigation landed in the inbox of an underfunded preservation office right at the moment when that office was about to spend 2 years in crisis management. That is a generous interpretation. The less generous interpretation is that the data was recognized for exactly what it was, a finding so far outside the boundaries of accepted prehistoric chronology that engaging with it officially carried enormous institutional risk, with no clear upside for anyone involved in state bureaucracy. Think about it from their perspective. You are a state preservation officer. Someone hands you radar data suggesting structures that are 10 times older than the oldest known constructed site on Earth, located in the middle of one of the most ecologically sensitive and legally complex waterways in North America. What do you do with that? The surveying team, meanwhile, did not go away. Through 2020 and into 2021, the lead surveyor, a man named David Kelly, who had spent 22 years doing exactly this kind of infrastructure mapping work across the Gulf South, began reaching out systematically to university archaeology and geology departments, to independent researchers, to anyone with the credentials and equipment to take the data seriously and the professional courage to say so publicly. Most of the responses he received fell into one of two categories: either polite expressions of interest that never converted into actual collaboration, or more direct communications, suggesting that pursuing this line of inquiry would be professionally inadvisable. One response from a department head at a southeastern research university, quoted in a 2022 independent documentary about the site, told Kelly plainly that no tenured faculty member in that department could afford to attach their name to a claim that would require rewriting the entire timeline of human civilization without a level of corroborating evidence that simply did not yet exist. And yet, despite that wall of institutional resistance, the data kept finding its way to people who were willing to look at it honestly. By mid-2021, a small informal consortium had formed around the Louisiana site, consisting of independent researchers, a retired professor of Mesoamerican archaeology from the University of New Mexico, and two geologists who had previously published peer-reviewed work on anomalous subsurface formations in coastal sedimentary environments. This group began pooling resources to fund what the state government had refused to authorize: a proper, methodical, multi-instrument investigation of the Atchafalaya anomalies using every non-invasive technology available to modern science. They were not rich. They were not backed by any institution. They crowdfunded a portion of their equipment costs, applied for 2 small private research grants, and drove to Louisiana in a rented van with a trailer full of borrowed geophysical instruments. The expanded survey they conducted over 3 weeks in August and September of 2021 produced results that made the original 2019 radar data look like a rough sketch compared to a finished painting. Using a combination of ground-penetrating radar, seismic refraction tomography, and magnetometry, the consortium mapped the subsurface of their target area with a resolution that the original survey team's equipment could never have achieved. Seismic refraction tomography works by sending controlled sound waves into the ground and measuring how long they take to travel between sensors, essentially building a 3-dimensional picture of underground density variations with extraordinary precision. Imagine using sound to see through 100 feet of earth the way a doctor uses ultrasound to see through skin and muscle, and you begin to understand what this technology can reveal. What the 2021 survey revealed pushed the number of distinct anomalies from 7 to 19. The new features included what appeared to be a series of smaller structures arranged in a roughly linear pattern extending northeast from the primary formation, as well as 2 circular anomalies with internal complexity that the magnetometry data suggested might contain materials with different magnetic properties than the surrounding sediment, which could indicate the presence of processed stone, fired clay, or even metallic components. You need to pause on that word, metallic, because what it implies about the people or beings who built these things is almost too large to hold in your mind comfortably. Metal processing requires fire, requires knowledge of ore extraction, requires a level of technological sophistication that our species is generally not thought to have possessed 100,000 years ago. The retired Mesoamerican archaeologist on the consortium team, Dr. Raymond Voss, published a preliminary analysis of the 2021 data through an independent research journal in early 2022, carefully framing his conclusions in the most conservative language he could manage, while still being honest about what the data showed. He wrote that the anomalies displayed, in his professional assessment, characteristics inconsistent with known natural geological processes and consistent with deliberate construction activity, while acknowledging that the implications of that assessment for the established chronology of human civilization were extraordinary and would require extraordinary corroboration before any definitive conclusions could be responsibly drawn. That is the language of a careful scientist trying to tell the truth while minimizing the size of the target on his back. Think about what it costs someone with a lifetime of professional reputation invested in mainstream archaeology to write those words in a published document. The response to Voss's paper was swift and almost entirely negative within academic circles. 2 geologists published a rebuttal within 3 months, arguing that the Louisiana Gulf Coast region's complex history of salt dome formation, subsurface methane migration, and periodic seismic activity could account for the geometric anomalies without invoking any human agency whatsoever. This is a legitimate scientific argument that deserves to be taken seriously, and Voss and his colleagues did take it seriously. They spent considerable time and analytical effort examining whether salt dome dynamics in particular could produce the right-angle corners and consistent wall thicknesses that their instruments were recording. Their conclusion, laid out in a response paper published later that same year, was that salt dome formations do produce striking and sometimes dramatic subsurface geometries, but that they do not produce the specific combination of features present at the Louisiana site: the consistent thickness, the orthogonal corners, the spatial relationship between multiple separate structures, simultaneously and in the same location. Meanwhile, something interesting was happening in the wider world outside the academic journals. Independent researchers with backgrounds in alternative history, ancient civilizations, and what is sometimes called archaeoastronomy had gotten hold of the survey data and were running their own analyses. Some of what they produced was frankly speculative, connecting the Louisiana anomalies to Atlantis, to lost continents, to extraterrestrial intervention, to virtually every mystery tradition that has ever captured human imagination. You can understand why. When you find something this old and this inexplicable, the human mind reaches for the most dramatic possible framework to contain it. But buried within the more sensational interpretations were some genuinely interesting observations. Several independent researchers noted that the spatial arrangement of the 19 anomalies, when plotted on a map, bore a suggestive relationship to the positions of certain stars in the constellation Orion, as they would have appeared from that latitude approximately 100,000 years ago, accounting for the slow wobble of Earth's axis known as precession. This is the kind of claim that mainstream science tends to dismiss almost reflexively, and perhaps correctly so, because the human pattern recognition system is so powerful and so hungry for meaning that it will find constellations in random noise if you let it look long enough. But it is worth noting that the same basic argument, that an ancient site was deliberately aligned with astronomical features, was once considered fringe speculation about Göbekli Tepe, and has since been substantially supported by careful analysis. The history of archaeology is littered with examples of ideas that were laughed out of conferences in one decade and accepted as established fact in the next. Imagine standing at one of those conference tables in 1970 and trying to argue that there was a 12,000-year-old ceremonial complex in Turkey built by hunter-gatherers with no pottery and no writing. You would have been shown the door. By 2023, the Louisiana site had attracted the attention of a team from a European research institute that has significant experience investigating underwater and waterlogged archaeological sites around the world. Having previously worked on submerged Neolithic settlements in the North Sea and prehistoric coastal structures off the coast of India. This team brought with them a technology that had not previously been applied to the Atchafalaya anomalies: underwater LiDAR, which uses laser pulses rather than sound or radio waves to build three-dimensional maps of submerged terrain with millimeter-level precision. The results of their 2-week survey, conducted in late 2023 and not yet fully published at the time of this script's research, were described by one team member in an interview as the most significant thing I have seen in 30 years of working in this field, which, from a scientist trained in deliberate understatement, is essentially the equivalent of someone else jumping up and down and screaming. The larger question that all of this evidence forces us to confront is not simply archaeological. It is a question about human identity and human time. We carry with us, almost without examining it, an assumption that civilization is a recent invention, that for the vast majority of the 200,000 or so years our species has existed, we were simple, small-brained, survival-focused creatures with no capacity for large-scale organized construction. This assumption is the foundation on which every history book, every museum, every educational curriculum is built. Now imagine that the Louisiana structures are exactly what the data suggests they are. Imagine that someone, something, some community of beings with the knowledge and organization to raise city block-sized rectangular structures with 2-meter-thick walls was doing exactly that in what is now the Atchafalaya Basin, 130,000 years ago. Everything we think we know about ourselves, about how long it takes a species to develop complexity, about whether civilization is something new or something that may have risen and fallen multiple times across deep time, all of it opens up like the ground beneath your feet. David Kelly, the surveyor who first flagged the anomalies in 2019, gave a rare extended interview to an independent podcast in early 2024. He was asked what he believed the structures were, and his answer was careful and honest, in a way that professional scientists are rarely allowed to be. He said he did not know what they were. He said he knew what his instruments had recorded, and he knew what the sediment dates had returned, and he knew that every natural explanation he and his colleagues had tried to apply had failed to account for all the data simultaneously. And then he said something that has stayed with the people who heard it. He said that the part that kept him awake at night was not the mystery of who built the structures or how old they were. The part that kept him awake was the thought that whatever had happened to the civilization that built them had happened so completely, so thoroughly, so absolutely, that for 100,000 years not a single trace of it had reached the surface of the earth, until a radar unit in a rented boat in a Louisiana swamp picked it up by accident on an unremarkable Tuesday morning in the spring of 2019. The swamp does not give up its secrets easily or quickly. It took 100,000 years and a piece of survey equipment pointed in the right direction at the right moment to get this far. How much further the truth extends beneath that dark water and compressed sediment, and what it will cost in courage and resources and willingness to be wrong about almost everything we thought we knew, that remains for now as submerged and as silent as the structures themselves. Do not forget to subscribe. See you next time.